The Art of Fermentation is one of those books that's out there to improve your technique and experiment with cooking. It's written by Sandor Katz, a fermentation fetishist, as self-described by him, and it's a book that goes over fermentation, the practices, and the best foods out there. If you watch Joshua Wiseman on YouTube, you can tell that a lot of his recipes come from this book because they're very similar. Also, Brad from It's Alive on Bon Appetit, he says he uses this book frequently for reference. So you can tell a lot of professional chefs use this book. And when I read online, a lot of people generally just use this book for fermentation. Though I really believe that Sandor is more of a do-it-yourself cook than a fermentation expert. Throughout the book, he's a champion for locally sourced food and bringing back food that we grow ourselves and bring to the kitchen ourselves. Katz, or Sandor Katz, was born in New York City, but moved to Tennessee after discovering Radical Fairies, a queer community of self-sustaining farmers that he was intrigued when he heard of them. He is also a 20-year AIDS survivor, and he's talked about how eating fermented food has helped him with his digestion, which was an issue that he faced when he was first diagnosed. In an interview with Vice, he talks about enjoying sour pickles as a kid and that these pickles brought his attention to sour foods. But it wasn't until he moved to the farming community where his passion took off. One day on his farm, since he was a naive city slicker starting a rural life, he didn't realize that all the cabbage he grew would be done at the same time, so he needed a way to store it. So he discovered sauerkraut. He made sauerkraut to preserve his bounty, and from that, he learned how to make yogurt, cheese, miso, tempeh. His curiosity just grew into seeking out every realm of fermentation. His passion went from fermentation to teaching about fermentation and for people to understand the benefits of fermentation at home. He wants everyone not to be afraid of fermentation and that it doesn't need to be an industrialized process to be safe. People have been fermenting for thousands of years, and he wants to bring back home fermentation instead of just going to the store and buying the yogurt that's available or the sauerkraut that's on the shelf. Sandor Katz is definitely passionate about fermentation. I imagine him being a fermentation hermit, stuck in his cellar, boiling over his jars of bacteria and life growing. The book has everything you really would need to know about fermentation. There's so much to learn here, covering fermentation to make alcohol, to fermenting vegetables, to fermenting meat, and even more other non-food applications for fermentation. Sandor Katz also goes over cultures who ferment and the recipes that come from those cultures. And I mean cultures, I mean, a group of people, not bacteria cultures. He's not shy to admit that he does not know everything, and I appreciate his humbleness. He wants the reader to discover fermentation practices themselves and to delve past this book. There's a chapter on equipment you might need, even chapters if you want to make a business with fermentation. I can tell Katz is dedicated in not only fermentation, but sharing his knowledge and nurturing the minds of cooks who might be scared or timid of fermentation. This book has inspired me to do so many projects. I started a kombucha batch with some SCOBY that I bought. I started making ume syrup, which is green plum tea syrup. Started making umeboshi, which is a Japanese salted fermented pickle. Takes about a year, and so hopefully it's good. I've also made some kimchi, fermented hot sauce, and I even made some rice wine that was pretty good. I have so much life growing in my house now, it makes me feel a little less lonely. This book is great because there's so much information on the topic of fermentation. What I'm making is a fraction of what you can make in this book. There's plenty to do, so you can find your interest reading this book. The biggest issue I have with this book, and it's just a stylistic choice, is the lack of concrete recipes in this book. There are really none I can find. Recipes are in paragraphs of sections. You really have to dig around and reread to get a recipe. Like I said, I'm making the umeboshi described in this book, but the recipe is from a quoted paragraph that he got from a friend. So you have to read the whole paragraph to get the recipe. There's no steps like 1, 2, 3. It's just a paragraph. I prefer recipes that have that kind of listed ingredients step, so it makes it easier for me to digest and know what I need to do. Sections might also be lacking recipe. Instead, Katz will kind of describe the fermentation process, his findings, and what the end result is like. I think the reason he has this format is because he wants people to experiment with fermentation. So if he has concrete recipes in this book, it just might keep people stuck with those recipes and discourage exploration. This book is just providing information, ideas, concepts, and best practices for fermentation. It's up to you, the reader, to explore more. Katz will talk about how he found recipes online or researched online. He's not afraid to seem like an all-knowing fermentation guru. He's just another cook curious with fermentating everything. There are annotations littered in this book and sources for his claims, which I think is awesome. Sometimes a cookbook can just have a bold statement with little evidence to back it up. So I really appreciate how rooted this book is. It reads like a very well thought research paper. His resource list is also extensive. The one website listed in this book, Gem Ferments, looks like it came straight from the 90s. It's even unsecured. just like websites from the 90s. This book is a must read. There's so much interesting topics in this book, and Katz is very extensive in his research and sections. It's a very free-spirited book, providing the foundation for a great fermentation future. This book has inspired me to try so much. I'm trying to embrace the free fermentation spirit Katz wants me to have, and I'm researching the next great fermentation recipe out there. I want you to go out there, read this book, and become a fermentation hermit. This cookbook, in my opinion, is a classic, and that's why I'm giving this book a 9 out of 10.